What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, Mtg. We like it in Magic, and yeah, my shirt is slightly tight, I think, but Bebop and Rocksteady are like the most Simic thing in the world when you really think about it, so I felt like this was the one for this video. But anyway, I've kind of already spoiled the topic, as did the title and thumbnail, so it's not like you didn't know what you were getting into. The Mighty Simic are back, and they're actually a real thing this time, if the results of the first, couple of MTGO standard league results are anything to be believed. Simic is kind of everywhere in a lot of different forms, but the deck I'm going to give you today is all about the climb. This card has climbed quite a bit since the last time I did a deck tech on it, which wasn't actually that long ago. And this time around, though, since Allegiance came out, we've got way better tricks than just Chamber Sentry. And don't worry, Chamber Sentry is not in this video, even though I will contend until the day I die that Chamber Sentry is a fine card, but you won't have to worry about it here. We've got a lot better tricks than that nowadays. Now, I have seen a couple of decks in league results playing this card, but I've seen anywhere between 2 and 4 and 0, so we haven't really settled on the proper number of climbs, but I'm going to put it right there in the middle between what we usually see. I don't want so few that we only play 2 and we don't see it every game, but I also don't want 4, for obvious reasons. It's legendary, and we kind of don't want multiple copies, even if we can get into a situation where we have a flipped into a winged temple, and we play it. What the? Well, I guess I'm doing the rest of this with a neck injury. We've had a hole in the ceiling of our kitchen for a while because I live in a garbage apartment, in case you didn't know that about us. And, yeah, just like plaster fell out of the hole in the ceiling, and Ziggy tore me up. Like, you see what he did to my neck. You see, like, right here on my hand, like, he got me, cuz, yeah, everyone in the comments, it's like, your cat's so calm. It turns out that when something like that happens out of nowhere, the cat is not very calm. He freaked out a little bit, but anyway, that's YouTube. What are we talking about? Hadana's Climb, that's what we're talking about. This is actually a fine card in and of itself, even without a bunch of other interactions to go with. It's got a lot of them in this deck, and I'll bring this card up a bunch of other times, but just in a vacuum, a card that on its front half puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature pretty much every turn, reliably. That's a good way to break stalemates right there. But once it flips over, it's effectively another land, helps fix your mana at the same time. That's great. So it's kind of rampy in a way, too. And it's another good way of breaking stalemates. That's basically just what happened to Ziggy. He got Flying Trample and doubled his power, and this is what happened to me. So imagine if you do that with a much bigger creature. Although I will concede there aren't a whole lot of creatures bigger than Ziggy. That is a monster behemoth cat. But anyway, let's move on from Climb for now, because again, I'm going to be referencing this card back and forth over and over in the video, and I don't want to spend 10 minutes talking about it up front, because again, it'll come up. We'll talk about it. But let's talk about what creatures we have to run in this deck first. Starting with Lawn War Elves, just an appetizer here, because this isn't the big thing that matters, but we still have to play Lawn War Elves almost certainly. We're trying to ramp into a bunch of stuff in this deck, and getting an extra free turn, basically, worth of mana production for just the 1 mana on turn 1 can lead into a turn 2 Hadana's Climb, or turn 3 a bunch of other 3-drops in the deck. But obviously, just the ability to ramp into a huge creature later on in the game a turn early is really important. So I don't even know why I'm explaining Lawnmower Elves to you, because you already know this is one of the best cards that's kind of ever been printed, in a way. So let's move on to its cousin, Incubation Druids. This thing's brand freaking new, and it's amazing, and kind of one of the big reasons to play this deck in the first place, or at least play Hadana's Climb. Now, obviously, the sequence that you're going to be aiming for here is turn 2 Druid into turn 3 Climb, at which point, like, starting on your second main phase, Climb's kind of paid for itself. You get 2 3-drops on turn 3, which is like, I got it written down here somewhere. Good. It's good to do that. There's also the fact the card's just good by itself. You don't need this ridiculous interaction with Hadana's Climb on turn 3 to make this card good. It's just a 2-mana dork, which are playable. Especially if you're able to go Lawn War Elves on turn 1, follow it up with Incubation Druid. Then suddenly you're producing 5 mana on turn 3. What is 3? Theoretically. And that's a good thing to do in a game of Magic. We have like 6 different 5-drops in this deck, and getting to those on turn 3 is a big game pretty much every time it happens. It's just a good mana producer even before it adapts, and then after it adapts, it's nuts. It's the best card in the deck. This thing is gnarly. I should probably put something on that. But anyway, show must go on. We're also playing Crab People in the deck because this guy is also awesome with Adonis Climb and good by himself. This is just like Incubation Druid. This is the best 2-drop we could ask for outside of like Merfolk Branchwalker, which we actually didn't end up playing in this build of the deck. I'll get to all that a little bit later. But if I've had to, draft 2-drops for this deck, it's definitely Incubation Druid and Growth Chamber Guardian, and we don't have room for too much else. But Growth Chamber is just crazy. Like, this card is already seeing way more traction than a lot of people, myself included, thought that it would at the beginning of the season. But this is in kind of everything nowadays. The ability to replace itself or just get a little bit bigger. A bear with upside is almost always good, and this upside is very, very, very favorable. That's a good word to use. In response to removal, it basically can't be lightning striked if you have open mana, which is always relevant. If you do, if the removal is going to kill it anyway, you still adapt it to go get another copy of it. But again, that's just it playing by itself. It's not a fair card on its own, but once you combine it with Adonis Climb, especially when you sequence it, turn 2, Crab People, into turn 3 Adonis Climb, then suddenly it's kind of busted because you just get a free, extra Simic Crab guy every single turn with Adonis Climb. So card is just, again, busted on its own, but Climb makes it that much better. If these cards had to rely on Climb to make them good, I don't think this deck would be very good. But considering that this deck doesn't need Climb to make its cards worth playing, I think this deck gets a lot more dangerous because of cards like this. But onto the 3-drops in the deck, we have to play more stuff than just Adonis Climb. If we get turn 1 Elves, we want to have a lot of options to ramp into on turn 3, and I think one of the best options in that department is Steel Leaf Champion, for this deck specifically. We're running 20 or so green sources in the deck, so it's not actually just too hard to cast this naturally, but the presence of Lawn Elves and Incubation Druid make it much easier to get this on turn 3, or turn 2 in the case of Lawn Elves. And this card gets a little bit more playable with Incubation Druid in the deck. Obviously, if you go, say, that sequence we were talking about earlier that you want so badly, which is turn 2 Druid into turn 3 Climb, well then starting main phase 2, you can just tap your Incubation Druid for 3 green mana and play Steel Leaf Champion, which is an insane sequence. Plus, obviously, Steel Leaf works really well with a flipped Adonis Climb. Can you tell I've had a lot of coffee today? I just feel like amped up for some reason, but it's probably just because I'm excited about this deck. Got a really good standard going on, and I mentioned that on Twitter the other day, but I'm really enjoying brewing in this standard. But anyway, quick aside, let's move on to more 3-drops because we're also going to fit in a couple of copies of Thrashing Brontodon. This card is very important in the current standard because there's so many enchantments we want to take out. That was a true statement going into Allegiance Standard. During Guild Standard, there were already plenty of main deck enchantments you might want to look out for, but now that Wilderness Reclamation is a card, yeah, and Theater of Horrors too, for what that's worth, but mostly Wilderness Reclamation, which a lot of people are kind of preemptively picking as the most busted card in all of Allegiance, and people are calling for it to be banned. I have seen that. Actually, many times, for what you've probably seen that too. And I'm just not sure. We haven't even really reached the end of week 1 as of this recording. I'm just not sure that Reclamation is as busted as it looks, especially with Burn having a presence in the format. I think Burn is just a natural counter to a strategy like that. But just with all of the Reclamations that we're seeing, I think it's really, really important to carry a couple of copies of Thrashing Brontodon in the main, especially considering we have Lawn Elves to ramp into it on turn 2. And when we do that, it's actually a big meaty threat on, that early in the game, especially again against these low to the ground aggro, these Judith decks and such. It's still going to block and you're still going to take a damage from Judith or whatever, but it's going to again just really serve as a giant speed bump that it's going to be hard for a lot of decks, with those small creatures to get around. That's really important, but again, just like Steel Leaf Champion too, it's an effective attacker early in the game against slower decks. But on to the actual, for realsies, definitely best card in the entire deck and the thing that makes Simic worth playing right now. And that's Hydroid Krasis. This thing is crazy. And I really want to go back to, the Spikes Reddit when this card was first spoiled and just be like, told you. It was amazing how many people were like, no, this card's bad. When it first got previewed, this card was obviously yoked. There's a reason that it's in just about everything now. We see Simic decks that play this card. We see Sultai decks playing this card. Teamer decks playing this card. Some green-red decks that splash blue specifically to play this card. I've seen this deck in Bant Nexus, or this card in Bant Nexus decks. So this thing is just popping up everywhere, and there's a reason its price tag is so unreasonably high right now. It is maybe the single best all-around card from Allegiance. This thing is just bonkers. Because time and time again, people underestimate how good the ability to play a card at multiple different casting costs actually is. This is a 4-drop, occasionally, never, but occasionally a 3-drop. But very often it starts at 4-drop, 6-drop, 8-drop. In the very late game, you can actually pump like 10 mana into this thing and draw all of the cards in the world, but it's actually not that hard to pump 8 mana into it. If you say reach turn 3 and you've got a Hadam's Climb, you play an Incubation Druid on turn 4, put the counter on it, then suddenly on turn 5 if you play a land, then you have 8 mana. Playing this on turn 5 for 8 mana is not incredibly, it's not a stretch, it's not Christmas land. And if you're able to do that, then suddenly you're drawing a buttload of cards. 3 cards, 3 life, and a 6/6 flying trample is where you want to be on turn 5, or 6, or 7 for that matter. But even if you have to play this for 6 mana, that's okay. You're still getting 2 cards, 2 life, and a 4/4 flyer, which is still a really, really good rate. It can just get way better as the game goes on, and especially if you draw this on turn 12 or 13 in a longer game, it breaks the game wide open, refills your entire hand, even gives you a bump in life. And even if they counter the spell, you still get this trigger on cast. So if you're at turn 14 in a War of Attrition against Control, then suddenly it doesn't matter if they counter your Krasis, you got a whole grip full of cards, you are going to win that game. But onto a card I've been slightly less impressed by, but it still made the deck, and that's Sugandha. Sugandha is, by the way, on closer inspection, this is something else that disappoints me, is that she's wearing like a fish suit. That's just kind of, I don't know if that's weird or cool, but I find it weird. I err on the side of weird, is what I'm saying. So that's off-putting. But my actual problem with this card is that if you go turn 2 Incubation Druid, you want to ramp into a 4-drop on turn 3. That's the best thing you can do. Well, if you ramp into a Sugandha, your creatures aren't going to have +1/+1 counters on them, so you won't draw the card. You just get a 4/4. And that can sometimes be okay on turn 3, but I have some issues with that. That said, there are plenty of ways to get +1/+1 counters on creatures, or play creatures with +1/+1 counters on them. From Incubation Druid to Hydroid Krasis to Growth Chamber Guardian. There are tons of +1/+1 counter dudes in this deck, so if we do get Sugandha a little bit later on, it's pretty much always going to draw us a card. And its adaptability is actually super relevant, because when you do adapt it, it's going to be the biggest creature on board, like in 9 out of 10 games, like it beats Carnage Tyrant in combat if it adapts, and that's really relevant too. But moving on to the last creature in the deck, that's Biogenic Ooze. Actually made the main deck, not only of my list, but of, it turns out, a bunch of people's list. There's a little bit of validation here. This was on my sleepers list, but actually I'm not sure that it counts, because it turns out it was on a lot of people's sleepers list, which kind of doesn't make it a sleeper when you think about it. But this card is actually extremely effective for finishing games out. We've got a few knockout punches in the deck. Hydroid Krasis late game is one of them. Steel Leaf Champion with, really anything, just about, with a flipped over, Wing Temple. Pretty good ways to finish a game, but this is maybe the clear-cut best way of actually finishing a game off in this deck. It punishes decks, especially that want to go long, decks like Golgari, or even in the mirror match where you're playing against the sort of, I say mirror match, but really like the Sultai Wild Growth Walker deck. That deck wants to go relatively long. And a card like this really punishes those strategies, especially ones that are kind of low on removal. And we're presenting a bunch of really important removable targets, Steel Leaf Champion, Hydroid Krasis, and so on. So by the time we get to a Biogenic Ooze, we may have run our opponent out of removal. So the secret of the Ooze is that it comes into play a little bit later on in the game, where we've hopefully exhausted a couple of removal options from our opponent, and it'll grow from there. If they leave out Ooze for 2 turns, that is game, son, especially if you can just start pumping mana into it. This is the best sync in the deck, bar none. The ability to just make creatures that inevitably get bigger as the game goes on not only breaks stalemates, but it keeps stalemates from happening in the first place. Like, the late game ability of this card once it starts going is much better than a card like Pindershoot Dryad, which I did not think I would say, but this just makes much, much bigger creatures and makes, just a much more imposing army for your opponent to have to get around. And again, if they leave it unchecked for just a couple of turns, they're in a huge deal of trouble. Even though this is Simic, and we obviously want to play a bunch of creatures, there's room for more spells in the deck, because we want to play Incubation Incongruity. This card is the nuts. Ink Incorporated is freaking good. It might be, again, the best split card of all of the split cards that we saw in Ravnica Allegiance. And I've already made that point, but, you know, getting some reps in really proves that, especially for a deck like Simic that needs a card like this. The second half is actually what you're going to end up casting more often, which really kind of surprises me as well. But the second half is just straight up removal and it exiles. So that's really important against Rekindling Phoenix, Arc-like Phoenix, pretty much any Phoenix in the format. And then Golgari and Sultai decks that want to grind advantage out of the graveyard. The exile clause is incredible, and we have plenty of creatures to outclass a 3/3. We're actually not that worried about it. So in a lot of ways, this is just straight removal, you know? Like, the token that it leaves behind can just be blocked or killed by like an ooze token, and we don't care. So like Incongruity is an insane card by itself, but Incubation will sometimes help you find that ooze that you need, or, you know, whatever creature you're looking for, Krasis in the late game, or even an Incubation Druid on turn 1 if you've got a Hadana's Climb in your hand and you want that turn 2 Druid, then playing Incubation on turn 1 might be just the thing you need, Jack. So I really like everything this card can do for you. In a way, it's filtering, which the Simic deck needs. It needs a sort of card, not card advantage, but at least card filtering piece like this. On the other hand, Simic also obviously needs a removal piece, because it plugs up a lot of gaps that Simic traditionally has. And so does Vivien Reid. Vivien, you could actually make the argument, does the same things. You know, Vivien is a removal tool on the one hand, and a card advantage piece on the other hand. Straight up card advantage. In this case, though, if this gets you a couple of extra creatures over the course of a game, or even lands for that matter, then it's a good card. You know, just as a 5-mana card advantage piece, especially against slower decks, that's where you want to be, but the ability to just blow up enchantments, already talked about how important that is. And with 3 Vivies and 2 Thrashing Brontodons in the deck, we're not really that worried about imposing enchantments at all, you know, but this also blows up flying creatures. For the most part, we're looking to generate card advantage and blow things out of the air, or, you know, problematic enchantments. And so I think that Vivie is worth playing a 3 of in the main deck. Now here are the lands right here. Obviously we play the 4 Breeding Pool, the 4 Hinterland Harbor. These 2 color mana bases aren't really rocket science to figure out. You know, you got to figure out the right ratio of basic lands. That's sometimes the hardest thing to do, but in this deck we're doing 13 Forest and 3 Island. That gives us 21 total green sources in the deck to help us cast Steel Leaf Champion without help. Now, as far as the sideboard, this is mostly populated by counterspells, as most Simic decks, I think, are going to be this season. You know, we've got Negate in there, usual suspects. Negate is pretty obvious against control decks and as an anti-removal piece, but so is Spell Pierce. People are going to be looking to play Experimental Frenzy and Wilderness Reclamation, and Spell Pierce is very good against them on turn 4, while not sucking up all of our mana. You know, we don't have to hold up 2 mana. The difference between 1 mana and 2 mana is monumental. It's enormous. So Spell Pierce is a very fine card in Simic sideboards right now. But so is Disdainful Stroke, just more counter magic. This is also good if you're keeping score against both Experimental Frenzy and, more importantly right now, Wilderness Reclamation. But it also takes out Teferis and Hydroid Krasis and such. So really important card to play right now. At least reserve 1 spot in the sideboard for it. But there's also Frilled Mystic, which counts as a counterspell. If we go first, this also counters, you know, problematic turn 4 plays that we want to watch out for, but everything else past those turn 4 plays as well. But we've also got Carnage Tyrant against control. That's a no-brainer. This card could actually make the main deck pretty easily. We've got a few ways to ramp into it between all the dorks that we're playing and Hadana's Climb flipping over. So I think there's an argument for playing Tyrant in the main deck, but I don't want to have it against really low-to-the-ground aggro decks that are just going to blow us out if we start the game with a Carnage Tyrant in our hand most of the time. Aside from that, the only other card in the sideboard is Mass Manipulation, which is kind of a soft slot. But again, against decks that want to go relatively long, we can easily steal 2 creatures with this. And we have Incubation Druid in the deck to make it a lot easier to cast. So I like just about everything about this card. Again, in longer games, where stealing 2 creatures is basically going to be a free win. Let's have a look at your power rankings right here. A final score of 68, which is that's fine. It's a good score right there. You know, never has Simic felt this competitive in Standard. I mean, I want to say never. That's not true, you know. But in a very, very long time, I have not felt like Simic was this good of a deck just by itself, without adding, you know, white or black or red. You know, we've seen Teamer, Sultai, Bant all be extremely competitive, but Simic by itself, Never. It always needs help. In this case, though, I think that Incubation Incongruity gives us a little bit of help in the removal and filtering department that we usually have to rely on some other colors for, especially when it comes to removal. You know, and Vivian Reed is the kind of planeswalker that we have not had access to in Simic in pretty much ever. I think I can safely say that. You know, another removal piece that a deck like this doesn't usually get to have. So we get a bunch of pieces that make Simic way, way better than it traditionally is as a philosophy that, again, helps sort of fill up some of the holes that it normally has. Aside from that, though, it ramps into big, stupid guys better than it ever has, too. Because, again, Hydroid Krasis, Sun Krasis is just the exact thing a Simic deck wanted. It does all the things that it needs, you know. It's a huge, flammable creature in the late game. It draws cards for Simic. Again, Simic needs that. It needs a refill in the mid to late game. And it gains us life to make sure that we don't fall too far behind, or at least can catch back up against the aggro decks that we sometimes have bad game against while we're trying to establish a ramp plan. So this deck just has all the tools that Simic kind of always needed to be a real deck. The only problem is, if you're interested in trying this deck out, it's expensive, but this is the beginning of the season. You know, we try to put some really good decks out there for you, but I promise there's going to be budget decks relatively soon. So keep that up. I'm going to put some budget decks in the poll on Patreon. You know, if you want to vote in those to get not only, you know, whatever your favorite budget deck is coming up, but your favorite, you know, deck period. I do polls like 3 times a week. So if you want to vote for what decks you want to see, just throw $1 to me on Patreon. But if you want to try this deck out, you can always hit the first link in the description. Go over to TCG Playa. They sponsor my content. They're good folks for that reason. But they also help bring you cards for the absolute bottom lowest price you can possibly get. Aside from that, we've already done a couple of deck techs this season. In case you missed those, I'll leave links in the description to them too. You know, the Gruul, we've already done them. Gruul is a really good deck right now, y'all. But we also did Judith, which is my favorite deck of the season so far, at least. Just red-black straight Judith Aristocrats. If you missed that, link in the description there too. But aside from that, do all the YouTube stuff. Like, share, subscribe, hit the bell, blah, blah, blah. More deck techs coming up. Just help me out any way you possibly can. From the $10 patrons all the way down to all I did was like the video. I just appreciate you being here. So thanks, guys. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Appreciate you guys. I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from the place. I'll say it again. Why not? Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.